51 elite cadets broke during the Absolute Zero certification trial, screaming into dead, calm channels for an extraction that was never coming. Among the shivering, defeated mass, one lone recruit from a planet the rest of the galaxy still refused to visit sat calmly in the freezing dark, genuinely, personally offended that nobody had thought to pack instant Blinny mix. Colonel Draven Holt paced the length of the briefing room, his heavy boots striking the reinforced deck plating with a rhythmic, deliberately intimidating cadence. Behind him, a massive holographic projection rotated slowly, casting a cold blue light across the faces of 52 raw, nervous cadets crammed into rows of hard plastic seating. The projection displayed the Permafrost 9 artificial tundra facility, a state-of-the-art environmental simulator privately funded and operated by the Solvanix Corporation, one of the largest defense contractors in the Meridian Coalition's sprawling supply chain. Permafrost 9 was not merely a testing ground. It was, in the words of every cadet who had ever survived it, an executioner of ambition, purpose-built to push the Coalition's brightest recruits past their physical and psychological breaking points, and to make absolutely certain that whoever emerged on the other side of it had earned the uniform they wore. In precisely 3 hours, Holt barked, his voice ricocheting off the metal bulkheads, you will deploy into Grid Sector 4. This is a Class 9 blizzard drill. For those of you who spent your childhoods on climate-controlled agricultural colonies or under the artificial suns of Meridian Prime, allow me to clarify exactly what Class 9 means. He tapped a control on his sleeve, and the projection shifted, displaying a scrolling column of environmental data. It means an ambient temperature of -80 degrees Celsius. It means wind shear capable of ripping a heavy transport shuttle clean off its own landing struts. It means zero visibility, failing sensors, and the particular kind of deep, biting cold that makes your own bones feel as though they've been replaced with shattered glass. In the front row, Julian Ashfordvale leaned back slightly in his seat, a thin, practiced smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Julian was the golden son of the Meridian Coalition's oldest mining dynasty, born and raised on the pristine, fully terraformed paradise world of Elysium Crest, a place where the weather was scheduled to the hour and mathematically perfected down to the humidity. He wore the finest Solvanix thermal suit currency could buy, a sleek charcoal and silver piece of engineering that promised, according to its own marketing materials, absolute thermal regulation under any conceivable planetary condition. To Julian, the upcoming drill was little more than a tedious bureaucratic formality, one more minor hurdle standing between him and his inevitable ascension to fleet command. 3 rows back, entirely ignored by the glittering elite of the colonial worlds clustered near the front, sat Cadet Wren Callahan. Wren did not have a sleek, custom-fitted thermal suit. She wore standard-issue military bulk, heavily patched at the elbows, slightly frayed at the cuffs, the kind of gear the quartermaster handed out to recruits whose families hadn't paid for an upgrade. She was small, quiet, and carried a pale, wind-scarred complexion that spoke of a childhood spent somewhere far from any UV-filtered paradise dome. Wren was from Earth, specifically, from the frozen, unforgiving interior of the Kalima wilderness, a stretch of Siberian tundra long since abandoned by anyone with the resources to leave it, populated now only by the stubborn, the poor, and the occasional fool who'd fallen in love with the silence. To the rest of the galaxy, Earth was a death world, a volatile, tectonically restless sphere of plague cycles, catastrophic storms, and violent, unpredictable seasons that had killed more of its own inhabitants across history than any war ever had. To Wren, it was simply home, and home had taught her things that no corporate engineering seminar ever would. She had enlisted 3 years earlier, at 19, not out of any particular romantic notion of galactic service, but because the recruitment officer who'd visited her regional settlement had offered a signing incentive large enough to finally repair her grandmother's aging water reclamation unit, a machine that had kept the two of them alive through 11 consecutive winters, and had finally, stubbornly, begun to fail. Wren had read the fine print of her enlistment contract twice, found nothing in it she couldn't live with, and signed it in the same unhurried, practical manner she approached most decisions that mattered. She had never once, in 3 years of training, expected to be liked by the sons and daughters of coalition wealth seated ahead of her. She had also never once needed to be. Being liked, she'd learned Arlie mattered considerably less than being right when it counted, and Kalima had taught her exactly how to tell the difference between the two. Beside her, a cadet named Deshon Akri leaned over, whispering under his breath, "You're not even a little nervous about this." "I'm nervous," Wren said quietly, without looking away from the podium. "I'm just not nervous about the same thing everyone else in this room is nervous about." "What's that supposed to mean?" "They're nervous about the cold," Wren said. "I've been cold my whole life. What worries me is a corporation running its own safety drill on its own equipment, grading its own homework. Where I'm from, that's usually the moment right before something goes very wrong." Deshon didn't have a response for that, and the briefing moved on before he could think of one. "Your objective is simple," Holt continued, slamming a fist against the briefing podium hard enough to snap every wandering eye back to the front of the room. "You will be dropped at Point Alpha. You will navigate 14 kilometers through the storm to Point Bravo, where a specialized solvanix extraction team will be waiting. You have 8 hours. If your core temperature drops below critical parameters, your suit will automatically trigger a red line beacon, and you will be pulled from the field. If you trigger the beacon, you fail. If you deviate from the path and get lost in the ice canyons, you fail. If you die," he paused, and something almost like dark amusement flickered behind his otherwise stony expression. "Well, Solvanix has a very thorough legal waiver. I'd encourage you all to read it before you signed it, though I doubt any of you did." Julian scoffed loudly enough for the whole front row to hear. "Colonel, with all due respect, our TR-7 environmental suits are rated for absolute zero vacuum exposure. A little snow isn't going to compromise coalition-grade hardware." Holt stopped pacing and locked eyes with him, a cold, almost predatory smile creeping across the veteran officer's weathered face. "Is that so, Cadet Ashford Vale? You place your absolute faith in corporate engineering?" He let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable. "Excellent. Let's see if your TR-7 can negotiate with a wind chill that freezes oxygen straight out of the air." Wren quietly adjusted the collar of her standard-issue suit and said nothing. She'd spent the entirety of the briefing mentally calculating the thermal conductivity of the suit's inner lining, cross-referencing it against numbers she'd learned the hard way, years before anyone had ever handed her a uniform. It was adequate. Barely. She knew from long, cold experience that technology always had a breaking point, somewhere past the edge of whatever chart the engineers who built it had bothered to draw. Her grandmother had taught her that when the machines finally froze, the human body's own stubbornness was the only heater a person could ever truly count on. Wren patted the bulky side pocket of her utility belt, checking that her personal rations were still secure. She'd smuggled a few unauthorized items out of the mess hall the night before, anticipating a long, boring, miserable walk through the snow. She always did. It was a habit her grandmother had drilled into her before Wren could walk properly on her own 2 feet. Never trust a storm to be exactly as bad as the forecast said it would be. Trust it to be worse, and be pleasantly surprised if it wasn't. The sirens wailed, signaling the end of the briefing. 52 cadets rose in unison, moving toward the deployment bay in a current of nervous, electric energy. The specific kind of anticipation that precedes a military exercise everyone privately suspects is about to go badly wrong. Solvanix technicians strapped the cadets into heavy drop pods, sealing the airtight harnesses with loud, mechanical clanks that echoed through the bay like the closing of 100 small coffins. Wren found herself strapped in beside a hyperventilating cadet named Milo Fenn, a gentle, wide-eyed farm boy from one of the agricultural worlds out past the Threll Belt. His face already gone pale and waxy before the pod had even dropped. "Hey," Wren said softly, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the deployment engines spooling up around them. "Just breathe. Keep your hands balled inside your gloves. Don't let your fingers separate. It conserves heat." Milo nodded frantically, though his eyes were wide with something close to blind panic, the particular kind that comes from a life spent entirely without any real reason to be afraid of the weather. "I've never even seen real snow," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the engines. "Not falling from a sky, just in pictures. My whole colony's climate-regulated. My mother used to joke that the biggest weather event I'd ever survive would be a strong breeze during harvest season." "You'll be fine," Wren said, and meant it as much as she could mean anything about a drill she already had a bad feeling about. "Just stay close to me once we're on the ground. Don't wander. Don't trust the waypoint blindly. Trust your own eyes first." "Why wouldn't I trust the waypoint?" Wren considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because I've never once in my life trusted a machine to care whether I lived or died as much as I care about it myself. Machines don't get cold, Milo. They don't understand what cold actually costs a person. They just run the numbers they're given and hope the numbers were right." Before he could form a reply, the pod floor dropped away beneath them, and 52 cadets were hurled down into the howling white abyss of Permafrost 9. The descent was brutal. The landing was worse. The moment the pod doors hissed open, the storm invaded like something with intent, not merely cold, but a physical assault. A wind that shrieked like a wounded animal, a deafening roar that instantly overwhelmed the external audio sensors built into every cadet's helmet. The air was thick with microscopic ice crystals that struck the visor displays like a barrage of needles, obliterating any semblance of visibility within seconds. Julian Ashfordvale stepped out of his pod first, activating his helmet's heads-up display with a confident flick of his gloved fingers. "All right, listen up, Squad Alpha," he barked over the secure comms channel, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who had never once had a reason to doubt the machine strapped to his own body. "Form a wedge. Follow my telemetry data. We march straight through the valley, tight formation, no stragglers." For the first 20 minutes, the arrogance of good engineering held the storm at bay. The TR-7 suits hummed steadily, their internal microreactors pumping warm fluid through the capillary tubes woven into every cadet's undersuit. Julian marched at the head of the formation, chest puffed out, confidently following a glowing blue waypoint stitched across his visor. But Permafrost 9 was not a natural environment. It was a calibrated torture chamber, precision-tuned down to the last variable. And today something had gone catastrophically, deliberately wrong with the numbers behind the curtain. Deep in the observation bunker, Colonel Holt stared at the primary thermal readouts with a slowly building sense of dread. The ambient temperature was plummeting far past the drill's designated Class 9 parameters. It wasn't -80 anymore. It was -112 and still falling. Control, this is Holt. He snapped into his headset, his knuckles going white around the edge of the console. Check the environmental regulators. The simulation is exceeding safety thresholds by a wide margin. The wind shears tearing the topography apart out there. Colonel, a panicked Solvanix technician's voice crackled back through the static-laced channel. We've got a catastrophic logic loop in the central mainframe. The cooling towers are stuck fully open. We can't shut them down manually. Sir, this isn't a simulation anymore. It's a localized ice age. Abort the drill, Holt roared. Trigger the emergency extraction beacons. Pull them out now. I can't, sir. Atmospheric interference is too thick. The recall beacons are jammed completely. We can't get a lock on their telemetry, and the extraction shuttles are freezing solid to the launch pads. Out in the white hell of Grid Sector 4, the technological superiority of the Meridian Coalition's finest was collapsing in real time. Julian's HUD flickered, sputtered, then died entirely, the display cracking under sudden, extreme thermal shock. The internal microreactors of the TR-7 suits, desperately trying to compensate for a temperature they had never once been programmed to handle, began stalling out one after another. Panic is a contagious disease, and in the freezing dark, it spread through Squad Alpha faster than the wind itself. "My suit!" screamed a cadet named Priya Anand, her voice cracking sharply over the localized short-range radio. "The heater just shut off. I can't feel my legs. I can't feel my legs." "Keep moving," Julian shouted, though the raw terror bleeding into his own voice betrayed the crumbling of his earlier confidence. He stumbled blindly over a hidden ice ridge, crashing hard into a snowbank, frantically slapping at his own chest plate, trying to force a reboot out of a suit that no longer had any intention of listening to him. Nothing happened. The cold began seeping into his bones, a slow, agonizing paralysis that turned the sweat under his collar into a fine, brittle layer of frost against his skin. One by one, the cadets began to fall. The elite trainees from the Paradise Worlds, Elysium Crest, Meridian Prime, a dozen other gardens carved out of hostile space and made comfortable at enormous expense, had no psychological armor built up against the primal anim. Agony of freezing to death by inches. They huddled together in pathetic, shivering clumps, pressing their emergency extraction buttons over and over, entirely unaware that every signal was simply bouncing off the impenetrable wall of the artificial blizzard raging around them. Deshan Akri, the cadet who had questioned Ren's comeback in the briefing room, went down hard against a rock outcropping, his suit's diagnostic display flooding with cascading red failure warnings. "It's not responding," he gasped into the comms, his words already beginning to slur at the edges, the first insidious sign of a body's core temperature slipping past the point where clear thinking remained possible. "I told it to reboot. It's not listening to me." Nearby, a cadet named Pharaoh Denali, whose family had made a considerable fortune in orbital shipbuilding, had stopped moving entirely, curled against a rock face with his knees drawn to his chest, repeating the same 3 words over and over into a calm channel that no longer carried them anywhere. "Somebody help me. Somebody help me. Somebody help me." His suit's beacon blinked uselessly against a sky too thick with ice to carry the signal more than a few meters in any direction. It was, Ren would later reflect, the specific, particular horror of watching people who had never once needed to be afraid of anything discover. All at once, and with no warning, that fear was not a story that happened to other, less fortunate people. It was a physical thing, with weight and temperature and a taste like old copper at the back of the throat. And none of them had ever been taught what to do with it beyond scream and press a button, and hoped someone richer and more powerful than the storm itself would eventually come and make it stop. Wren Callahan, however, was not panicking. When her own standard-issue suit began to fail, roughly 15 minutes into the drop, she didn't waste a single second slapping at her chest plate or screaming into a dead channel. She recognized instantly the biting, metallic taste of true cold, the same cold that used to sweep across the Kalima tundra during the deep winter blackouts of her childhood, when the regional grid failed and her grandmother would simply sigh, light a lamp, and say, well, here we are again, as though the sky itself had merely dropped by for an inconvenient but expected visit. It was an old enemy. Wren knew exactly how to fight it, because she had been fighting it in one form or another for her entire life. She dropped to her knees, pulling herself out of the worst of the direct wind shear, and began aggressively digging into the side of a massive drift with her heavily armored gloves. "What are you doing?" Milo Fenn cried out, collapsing beside her, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely force the words out. "We have to keep walking, the waypoint, the extraction." "There is no extraction, Milo," Wren said, calm and steady, carving out a large, dome-shaped hollow in the packed snow with quick, practiced strokes. "Comms are dead. Wind's too loud for shuttles even if they could fly in this. If we stay out here another 10 minutes, the wind's going to strip every ounce of heat straight out of our bodies. Get in the hole." It's snow, it's freezing." "Snow's an insulator, you absolute farm boy. It traps ambient body heat instead of letting the wind carry it off. Get in the hole before your lungs freeze solid." Wren stood back up and waded straight back into the whiteout, following the sound of panicked whimpering through the shrieking wind. She found Julian Ashford Vale curled into a fetal position in a shallow drift, his expensive suit completely dead, frostbite already beginning to darken the edges of his lips into a sickening shade of blue. She grabbed his collar and hauled him backward through the snow with a strength that seemed to surprise even her, tossing him unceremoniously into the shelter she'd already begun. She went back out 3 more times after that, each trip a little harder than the last, each trip costing her a little more of the careful, banked heat her own suit's failing systems could no longer fully replace. She found Deshon Akri half buried against the rock outcropping where he'd fallen, his lips already moving without sound, some fragment of a prayer or a memory he'd stopped being able to finish. She hauled him upright, half-dragged, half-carried him the 30 meters back to the shelter, and returned almost immediately for Pharaoh Denali, still curled tight against his own rock face, still repeating his 3 useless words into a dead channel. "Denali." Wren crouched beside him, gripping his shoulder hard enough to break through whatever fog had settled over his mind. "Nobody's coming on the beacon. You're coming with me instead. Get up." Pharaoh blinked at her, uncomprehending, his eyes glassy and slow. "Somebody help me," he mumbled again, the words worn smooth from repetition. "I'm Rig." "HT here," Wren said. "That's the whole plan, get up." Something in the simple, unadorned certainty of her voice seemed to reach him where the storm and his own panic hadn't. He got up, stumbling, leaning almost his full weight against her narrow shoulders, and together they made the last slow, staggering trip back to the shelter, the wind screaming around them the entire way like it resented losing even one more life it had already half-claimed. Over the following 30 minutes, Wren moved like a ghost through the storm, operating almost entirely on instinct, and a kind of spatial memory she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't grown up needing it. She dragged, carried, and shoved 21 of her closest squad mates into the rapidly expanding snow trench, one after another, ignoring the burning ache building in her own shoulders with every trip back out into the wind, ignoring, too, the small, cold, honest part of her mind that kept a running count of how many more trips her own body had left in it before the math stopped working in anyone's favor, hers included. The remaining 30 cadets had scattered too far, lost entirely to the storm's white chaos, their bodies eventually entering a forced metabolic stasis as their failing suits automatically administered emergency sedatives. A last-ditch mercy against a death none of them would have survived conscious. Inside Wren's shelter, it was dark, cramped, and desperate. 21 highly trained military cadets sobbed, prayed, and hyperventilated in near-total darkness, entirely convinced they were about to spend the last minutes of their short lives buried alive in an icy grave on a corporate testing ground somewhere out past the edge of civilized space. Quiet! Wren's voice cut through the panic like a physical blow, and the whole huddled mass fell into stunned, immediate silence. Julian looked up at her, every trace of his earlier arrogance stripped entirely away, replaced by the wide, terrified gaze of a child. "Callahan, we're going to die here. The Solvanix suits, they failed, all of them." "The suits failed because they're built to negotiate with nature using binary logic," Wren said, unsealing her own helmet and letting it drop to the floor of the cave. She shook out her hair, entirely unfazed by the sub-zero air inside the shelter. "Nature doesn't negotiate. You don't survive the cold by trying to overpower it. You survive it by respecting it enough to work with what it gives you instead." "How do you know that?" Deshan asked weakly, from somewhere near the back of the huddle, his voice still thick and slow but steadying now, warmed by simple proximity to 20 other bodies packed into a space small enough to hold heat. "How do you just know all of this and none of us do?" Wren considered the question for a moment, running her thumb absently along the edge of her knife. "Because on Earth, this isn't a drill," she said. "It's Tuesday. It's the walk home from the water station when the wind picks up faster than the forecast said it would. It's what you learn before you learn to read, because if you don't learn it, you don't usually get old enough to need to read anything at all. I'm not smarter than any of you. I've just failed this test before, for real, with nobody grading me on it, and I only get to be standing here right now because I passed." In the Solvanix control bunker, the situation had degraded into complete, unmanaged chaos. Colonel Holt had one hand fisted in the collar of a corporate engineer's uniform, half shoving the man bodily into a console. "I don't care if you have to rip the cooling rods out of the reactor housing with your bare hands," Holt bellowed. 51 cadets are currently flatlining on my monitors. Their telemetry's dropping straight into the death zone, and you're going to fix it, or I am going to personally. "Sir, wait," a junior analyst, barely out of her own training, shouted from a side terminal, one trembling finger pointed at a secondary thermal display. "Look at grid Alpha 7. I'm reading an anomalous heat signature." Holt dropped the engineer and stormed over to the screen. Amid a sea of freezing blue and black topography, a tiny, vibrant speck of orange glowed steadily beneath a massive drift. "Is that an engine fire?" Holt demanded. "Did a shuttle go down out there?" "No, sir. The thermal profile's entirely organic. It's a combustion reaction. Someone built a fire." Holt stared at the screen, utterly bewildered. "A fire? Out there? With what? That environment is sterile ice and rock from one horizon to the other. There's no combustible material anywhere in that sector." Inside the snow trench, the orange glow of unlikely salvation flickered against the icy walls, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the terrified cadets. Wren sat cross-legged near the center of the huddle, a small, intensely hot fire crackling steadily in front of her. Julian stared at the flames. his mind visibly struggling to process what he was seeing. "How," he whispered, his voice hoarse and raw. "How did you do that? There's no wood, no fuel out here." Ren poked at the fire with the point of her tactical knife, entirely matter-of-fact. "Standard issue field medical kits," she explained. "They pack high-concentration rubbing alcohol swabs for sterilization and magnesium-based flare powder for emergency signaling. You mix the alcohol with the magnesium, scrape a little synthetic polymer off the lining of your boot for a binding agent, and strike it against the flint edge of a survival knife. Old Earth trick. My grandmother used to do this every winter the regional grid failed, and where I'm from, that was most winters." The cadet stared at her the way people stare at something they don't yet have a proper category for. Not quite a hero, not quite a stranger. Something closer to a minor, irritable deity who had descended briefly from a much colder heaven to grant them one more sunrise. They huddled closer to the flames, weeping openly in sheer relief as the temperature inside the shelter slowly crept from lethal toward merely, gratefully uncomfortable. Ren, however, looked deeply and personally annoyed. She reached into the bulky side pocket of her utility belt and pulled out a small, sealed foil packet, tearing it open with a sigh of profound disappointment to reveal a few dry, crumbling ration biscuits and a half-melted bar of standard military dark chocolate. "I can't believe this," she muttered, staring down at the meager haul. Milo Fenn leaned forward, shivering. Are you okay, Callahan? Are you hurt?" "I'm furious, Milo," Ren said, snapping off a piece of chocolate and popping it into her mouth, glaring at the beautiful, life-saving fire she just built as though it had personally wronged her. "I knew they were going to drop us in a freezer. I prepped for the cold. I prepped for the tech failing on all of you because it always does. But you know what I didn't prep for? The elite cadets of the Meridian Coalition, the future officers of an entire interstellar fleet, waited with genuine, bated breath for the profound tactical wisdom of the Death Worlder who had just saved every one of their lives." "I forgot the damn Blinny mix," Ren said, shaking her head in real disgust. "You cannot properly celebrate not dying in a blizzard without a hot pan of Blinny and real butter. It's practically an insult to my grandmother's memory. She would be so ashamed of me right now, sitting in a hole in the ground with nothing but stale crackers and chocolate to show for it." Julian blinked, utterly dumbfounded. Outside, a catastrophic engineered storm was actively threatening to tear the entire facility apart. A multi-billion credit corporate disaster was unfolding in real time. Half their squad was currently locked in cryogenic stasis, awaiting a rescue that might never actually arrive. And Ren Callahan was genuinely, sincerely upset about pancake mix. "Blinny," Julian repeated, his brain visibly struggling to reconcile the scale of the disaster with the scale of the complaint. "Callahan, we are sitting in a hole in the ground during a Class 9 catastrophe, and you're upset about breakfast food." "It's about morale, Julian," Ren replied, deadpan, leaning back against the icy wall of the cave and closing her eyes. "If you're going to almost freeze to death, you might as well do it properly. Now shut up, rotate your bodies every 5 minutes so you don't cook on one side and freeze on the other, and wait for Holt to fix his broken toy." For the next 4 hours, as Solvanix engineers frantically hacked their way past a corrupted mainframe to force shut down the rogue cooling towers, the 21 cadets inside the snow shelter simply sat in silence, surviving the howling, furious death raging above them, entirely untouched by it, protected by nothing more sophisticated than a hollowed-out snowdrift and a small, stubborn fire built from spare parts. When the storm finally broke, and the heavy mechanized treads of the Solvanix recovery vehicles finally breached the perimeter of Grid Alpha 7, Colonel Holt was riding on the front of the lead crawler, fully expecting, by his own later admission, to find 21 corpses waiting for him. The recovery team deployed heavy thermal boring drills to cut through the massive drift, bracing for a grim excavation. Instead, the crust of the snow caved in from below, and Wren Callahan popped her head out of the hole, blinking hard against the harsh glare of the recovery vehicle's floodlights. Holt jumped down from the crawler, boots crunching in the fresh snow, and simply stared for a moment, first at Wren, then past her into the shelter, where 20 of his elite cadets sat huddled around the dying embers of a magnesium fire, alive, mildly traumatized, and entirely, unmistakably in awe of the small woman from Earth who had gotten them there. Wren looked up at the intimidating colonel, wiped a smudge of soot off her cheek with the back of one glove, and offered a crisp, if slightly exhausted, salute. "Cadet Callahan," Holt said, his voice unusually quiet, entirely stripped of its earlier booming authority. "Report." "Squad Alpha secured, sir," Wren said, stepping out of the hole and brushing snow off her knees. "Minor frostbite among the Elysium and Meridian Prime contingents, but no critical casualties among my group. However, sir, I'd like to file a formal complaint regarding the operational parameters of this simulation." Holt narrowed his eyes. "A complaint, Cadet." "Regarding the catastrophic mainframe failure." "No, sir." Wren's expression was entirely, painfully serious. "Regarding the mess hall inventory. If Solvanix is going to mandate a winter survival scenario for the entire graduating class, the total absence of proper Blinny rations in the standard field kit represents a glaring oversight in tactical supply chain planning. I expect better from this academy, sir." Holt stared at her for a long, silent moment, the wind whipping around them both, the floodlights casting hard, jagged shadows across the frozen wasteland. Then, to the utter shock of everyone within earshot, the ruthless, iron-willed Colonel Draven Holt threw his head back and let out a booming, genuinely delighted laugh. "Noted Cadet Callahan," he chuckled, shaking his head slowly. "Get your squad on the crawler. I think we're done here for today." As the cadets began climbing aboard the warm interiors of the rescue vehicles, Julian Ashford-Vale stopped and looked back at Wren. The arrogance was gone entirely now, replaced by something closer to profound, grudging respect. He understood in that moment that all the money in the galaxy, all the pristine terraforming and advanced corporate engineering that a paradise world could buy, could never fully replace the raw, stubborn, generational resilience of a human being born on a world that actively tried to kill its inhabitants every single day of their lives. Earth might be a death world to the rest of the galaxy. But to Wren Callahan, the absolute worst the universe could throw at her was just one more inconvenient winter evening without proper breakfast. The medical bay monitors beeped with a sterile, rhythmic monotony that stood in stark, almost surreal contrast to the howling violence of Permafrost 9, still audible faintly through the reinforced hull outside. Bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights illuminated the pristine white walls of the Meridian Coalition Academy's trauma ward, where 21 shivering cadets now lay bundled beneath heavy thermal regeneration blankets, intravenous lines quietly pumping synthetic caloric substitutes and cellular antifreeze compounds into their veins. Wren Callahan sat on the edge of her own biobed, entirely ignoring the heated blanket draped uselessly over her shoulders, instead occupied with disassembling her standard-issue service pistol, methodically cleaning the internal mechanisms with a small rag. Aside from a slightly red nose and a few faint patches of windburn along her cheeks, She looked as though she'd just returned from a brisk autumn walk rather than a Class 9 Absolute Zero catastrophe. Across the aisle, Julian Ashfordvale looked considerably worse. The Elysium Golden Boy had lost the tips of his left index and middle fingers to frostbite, a permanent, physical reminder of a corporate engineering failure that would follow him for the rest of his career. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken and hollow, and the usual arrogant swagger that had defined his entire existence up to that point had been thoroughly, permanently scoured out of him by his brush with the freezing dark. Tension hung heavy over the medical bay, not from the lingering trauma of the ice, but from the looming shadow of a bureaucratic reckoning everyone in that room could feel gathering just outside the doors. The heavy pneumatic doors hissed open, and Colonel Holt marched in, flanked by two figures who clearly did not belong anywhere near a military medical facility. One was a tall, excessively groomed man in a bespoke polysilk suit that likely cost more than a cadet's entire annual stipend. The other was a woman carrying a sleek, glowing data slate, her eyes cold, calculating, and entirely unbothered by the rows of shivering recruits she walked past. "Attention on deck," Holt muttered, though his voice lacked its usual commanding bite. He looked exhausted, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle fluttered visibly beneath his skin. "Cadets," the man in the suit began, his voice dripping with practiced, professionally rehearsed sympathy. "I'm Halbrook Voss, Senior Vice President of Risk Management for the Solvanix Corporation. Beside me is Priya Sundaram, Lead Counsel for our Interstellar Defense Contracting Division. First and foremost, on behalf of the entire Solvanix leadership, we want to express our deepest relief that all of you survived what we are currently classifying as an unfortunate operational anomaly during yesterday's field exercise." Julian scoffed loudly, leaning his bandaged head back against the medical pillows. "Anomaly? Your central cooling towers went rogue, Voss. You trapped 52 cadets in a localized ice age. Your billion-credit TR. Suits bricked completely the moment the ambient temperature dropped past -90. Voss offered a thin, predatory smile that never once reached his eyes. "Cadet Ashfordvale, we understand your distress. However, our preliminary telemetry paints a somewhat different picture of the events in Sector 4. We are not here today to assign blame to the elements. We are here to convene a formal board of inquiry regarding the gross destruction of military property and the unauthorized sabotage of the Permafrost 9 environmental grid." Wren stopped wiping the barrel of her pistol. She slowly looked up, dark eyes locking directly onto Voss with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "According to our sensor logs," Priya Sundaram added smoothly, tapping her data slate with one perfectly manicured nail, "the catastrophic feedback loop in the main cooling towers was triggered by a localized thermal spike in Grid Alpha 7, a massive, unauthorized combustion event that scrambled the local thermal sensors, tricking the mainframe into overcompensating with maximum freezing protocols. Furthermore, we have preliminary evidence suggesting a cadet deliberately destroyed no fewer than 21 TR-7 thermal suits to harvest polymer linings for this unauthorized fire." Complete silence fell across the medical bay. The sheer audacity of the corporate lie was staggering. Solvanix was attempting to shift the blame for its own catastrophic hardware failure onto the very survival tactics that had kept a full squad of its own future officers alive. They were trying, with a straight face and a legal team already assembled, to hang the whole disaster on the Earthborn girl who had saved them. "You're accusing Cadet Callahan of causing the storm?" Milo Fenn asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of leftover cold and rising righteous anger. "She saved our lives." She initiated an unsanctioned chemical fire using stolen medical supplies and destroyed millions of credits worth of proprietary Solvanix hardware in the process, Voss corrected smoothly. A clear and serious violation of Academy protocol. Solvanix holds the primary defense contracts for the entirety of the Meridian Coalition fleet. Much like the old aerospace conglomerates of pre-expansion Earth once did for their own governments, we simply cannot allow a single rogue cadet's reckless panic to tarnish the reputation of our safety systems. Holt crossed his arms, his face unreadable, though a dangerous, banked fire had begun to burn behind his eyes. The tribunal convenes in exactly 1 hour in Hall 7, he said flatly. All ambulatory cadets from Squad Alpha will be present. When Voss and Sundaram swept back out of the medical bay, trailing an expensive cloud of cologne behind them, Holt lingered a moment longer, looking directly at Wren. "They're going to try to crucify you, Callahan," he said quietly. Solvanix stock dropped 9% this morning the instant rumors of the drill started leaking to the financial networks. They need a scapegoat, and an Earthborn recruit with no family money behind her is the cheapest target available to them. "Let them try, Colonel," Wren said, reassembling her pistol with a sharp, final, metallic click. "I grew up wrestling frozen fishing lines out of the Kalima ice in January. A couple of corporate suits don't scare me in the slightest." She spent most of the hour before the tribunal not preparing a defense in any conventional sense, but hunched over Julian's scorched suit processor in a corner of the medical bay. A borrowed diagnostic interface balanced awkwardly across her knees, working through the chip's corrupted memory sector by sector with the same patient, methodical attention she'd once applied to coaxing a failing water reclamation unit through one more winter. Milo, still tethered to his own biobed's monitoring lines, watched her work for a while before finally asking the question half the ward seemed to be silently wondering. "What exactly are you looking for?" "A reason," Wren said, without looking up from the display. "Voss says the suits failed because of my fire. That's backwards, and I know it's backwards, but knowing something isn't the same as being able to prove it to 5 judges, 2 of whom work for the company I'm about to accuse of lying. So I need something the diagnostic interface itself agrees with, not just my own memory of what happened." The processor's memory was a mess by the time she reached it. Fire-damaged in places, frozen and refrozen, as the ambient temperature had swung wildly through the worst of. The storm, most of its higher-level logging simply gone, overwritten or corrupted beyond recovery. But buried beneath the wreckage, in a low-level firmware layer that no ordinary diagnostic sweep would have thought to examine, she found something that made her sit very still for a long moment, running the same check twice to be certain she wasn't simply seeing what she wanted to see. It was a fragment of code that had no business existing anywhere in a thermal regulation suit's standard operating architecture. A small, self-contained routine, triggered by an external timestamp rather than any environmental sensor reading, that forced the suit's microreactor into a cascading shutdown sequence disguised, in its outward reporting, as an ordinary safety response to extreme cold. It was elegant, in the cold, clinical way that dangerous things sometimes were. Anyone examining the suit's own self-reported logs, exactly as Voss's diagnostic team surely had, would see nothing but a device correctly, faithfully doing its job in response to a genuine environmental threat. Only by digging past the suit's own account of itself, into the raw firmware beneath it, could anyone find the lie sitting quietly underneath. "It's not the cold that killed the suits," she said slowly, half to Milo, half to herself, still staring at the scrolling code. The cold is what it's designed to blame. Somebody built this to trigger on a schedule, not on a temperature. Somebody knew exactly when this drill was supposed to start and built the failure to happen a fixed number of minutes after deployment, regardless of what the actual weather did. She sat back, feeling something settle into place with the quiet, satisfying click of a puzzle piece finally finding its edge. This isn't a malfunction, Milo. It's a script, and scripts don't write themselves. Somebody sat down and wrote this on purpose, knowing exactly what it would do to whoever was wearing the suit when it triggered. She spent the remainder of the hour extracting and isolating the fragment, as cleanly as the damaged chip would allow, transferring it onto a small data crystal she tucked into her utility belt beside the useless foil ration packet she still hadn't quite forgiven the mess hall for. She did not, in that final hour, feel triumphant so much as she felt tired, and grimly, quietly certain, the way she imagined a person felt upon finally locating the exact source of a leak that had been slowly flooding their home for longer than they'd realized. You really think you can prove all that to a panel that includes 2 people who work for the company that built the thing? Milo asked, watching her seal the data crystal into her belt. I think the code doesn't care who's judging it, Ren said. I just have to make sure the room actually looks at the code instead of at Voss's suit and Voss's smile the entire time. That's the only part of this I can actually control. Hall 7 was a massive, amphitheater-style courtroom built specifically to intimidate. Its high-vaulted ceiling of dark, brushed steel looming over a central podium where Ren Callahan stood entirely alone. Above her, arranged along a raised dais, sat a panel of 5 judges, 3 high-ranking coalition admirals, and 2 civilian oversight directors directly affiliated with Solvanix's own corporate governance board. A conflict of interest so obvious that not a single person in the gallery bothered pretending it wasn't there. Behind her, filling the lower rows, sat the 20 surviving members of Squad Alpha, still bundled in their heavy academy winter coats. Cadet Callahan, began Admiral Renata Sterling, a stern-faced veteran who looked entirely uncomfortable seated beside the 2 corporate directors flanking her. You stand accused of gross negligence, destruction of military property, and directly triggering the Permafrost 9 mainframe collapse through the unauthorized detonation of a localized magnesium fire. How do you plead? I plead that your engineers are incompetent, Admiral, Ren replied, her voice ringing clear and steady across the cavernous room. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Halbrook Voss, seated at the prosecutor's table, rose smoothly and adjusted his cuffs. Insolence will not help your case here, Cadet. We have the telemetry. The TR-7 suits are rated for absolute 0 exposure. They do not fail. The only variable present in Sector 4 was your unauthorized fire, which our own diagnostic algorithms confirm caused the local thermal sensors to short-circuit, plunging the entire grid into a runaway deep freeze. My fire, Ren said, gripping the edges of the podium, was built 45 minutes after the storm first hit. 45 minutes after your TR-7 suits had already died on every single cadet in my squad. Do you have proof of this timeline? Voss pressed, a smug smile spreading across his face. Because our internal logs show the suits shutting down at precisely the S.A. moment as the ignition of your fire, a built-in safety mechanism designed to protect the wearer from exactly the kind of external thermal anomaly your fire represented. It was a lie, and a well-constructed one. Solvanix had quietly altered its own logs, a classic, ruthless corporate cover-up dressed up in the language of engineering precision. Without external telemetry of her own, Ren's word alone stood against a multi-billion credit defense contractor's entire legal apparatus, and everyone in that room knew exactly how such contests usually ended. "I'd like to call a witness, then," Ren said, before Voss could press his advantage any further. "Cadet Deshon Akri was among the first to suffer a suit failure. He can speak to the timeline directly." Admiral Sterling glanced toward the gallery, then nodded. "The tribunal will hear it." Deshon rose slowly from his seat, still favoring one leg slightly, a lingering souvenir of the frostbite that had crept into his boot before Ren had dragged him clear of it. He made his way to the podium, standing a careful half-step behind Ren, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the easy confidence he'd once shown back in the briefing room, replaced instead by something plainer and considerably more useful in a courtroom. "My suit's internal chronometer logged a complete power failure at 11 minutes past deployment," he said. "I know because I checked it obsessively while I was lying against a rock formation, unable to feel my own hands, watching the seconds count upward instead of counting down toward extraction, because extraction never came. Cadet Callahan found me approximately 34 minutes after that failure. I did not see, hear, or feel any fire until we were already inside the shelter she'd dug, which by my own suit's last working timestamp, before it died completely, was well past the point Mr. Voss claims his sensors registered a thermal anomaly. A single cadet's recollection under extreme physiological duress is hardly reliable testimony," Voss interjected smoothly. "Then check the chronometer yourself," Deshon said, unclipping the small internal logging unit from his own suit's collar and setting it on the podium beside Ren's silicon chip. "It's a hardware failure. It doesn't lie the way your telemetry apparently does, and it doesn't need me to be calm and collected while it was recording. It just kept ticking until the battery died." Voss did not have an immediate response to that, and for the first time since the tribunal had opened, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his otherwise composed expression. Before he could recover his footing, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the hall. Julian Ashford Vale rose from his seat in the gallery. He looked down at his own bandaged hand, missing 2 fingertips, and then looked directly up at the panel of judges. "Request permission to address the tribunal," he said, his voice carrying loudly enough to fill the entire chamber. "Cadet Ashford Vale," Voss warned smoothly, "you are still recovering from severe trauma. Your testimony is not required for these proceedings." "I am the squad leader of Alpha," Julian snapped, limping down the aisle to stand beside Ren at the podium. "And my testimony is exactly what's required here. Voss is lying. Solvanix is lying to this entire tribunal." The civilian directors leaned forward sharply, their expressions hardening in unison. "Cadet, be very careful with your next words," one of them warned. "I wore the TR-7, Julian continued, holding up his bandaged hand for the entire hall to see clearly. "I was following the telemetry personally. When the temperature crossed -90, my suit didn't trigger any safety shutdown. It catastrophically failed. The microreactor stalled out completely. My HUD cracked under thermal shock and died in my own visor. Cadet Annan's suit failed 3 minutes later. We were freezing to death in absolute darkness for nearly an hour before Cadet Callahan ever struck a single spark." "The trauma has clearly confused your timeline, Cadet," Voss interrupted smoothly. "Hypoxia and severe hypothermia are well documented to cause significant hallucination." "He's not hallucinating," Ren interjected, her eyes narrowing as she stared Voss down across the width of the hall. "And I can prove it. I didn't just build a fire out there, Voss. While we were waiting for the storm to break, I had a lot of free time on my hands. so I took apart the internal processing unit of Cadet Ashford Vale's bricked helmet. I wanted to see exactly why your billion-credit hardware failed. Voss's smug smile faltered, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second. Wren reached into her utility belt and produced a small, scorched silicon chip, placing it carefully onto the podium's central data reader. A holographic projection sprang to life above the central floor of the hall, displaying dense, rapidly scrolling lines of complex code. Lee. Growing up on Earth, Wren explained, her voice carrying an unshakable, quiet authority through the entire chamber. You learn a lot about ancient history, including how the old nations used to fight each other before humanity ever made it to the stars. When I cracked open your TR-7 processor, I recognized the logic pattern that forced the central cooling towers to jam open. It wasn't a malfunction caused by any fire I built. It was a deliberate cyber attack, engineered from the ground up. The three admirals leaned forward simultaneously, their earlier restraint dropping away entirely. Explain, Cadet, Admiral Sterling demanded. The code structure is a modified variant of an old Earth logic bomb, Wren continued, gesturing at the projection. A digital sabotage method first documented in the 21st century, originally used to destroy industrial equipment by forcing it to operate far outside its safe tolerances, while simultaneously feeding false all-clear readings to the humans monitoring it. Someone uploaded a program built on that exact same principle into the Permafrost 9 mainframe. It deliberately forced the cooling towers open to maximum output, while sending false telemetry back to Colonel Holt's control room the entire time. Dead silence swallowed the courtroom whole. Why would anyone do that? Admiral Sterling asked, her eyes slowly, deliberately turning toward the two Solvanix-affiliated directors seated at the far end of the dais. Because, Colonel Holt's voice boomed from the back of the hall as he marched down the central aisle, holding up his own data slate. I cross-referenced Cadet Callahan's findings against Solvanix's own recent financial filings. The Coalition Senate is scheduled to vote tomorrow on a trillion-credit military grant to overhaul the entire fleet's environmental survival arsenal. He stopped directly at the podium, glaring across the hall at Voss. Solvanix was losing that trial to a competing contractor. They needed to prove, decisively and publicly, that the current environmental hardware was so hopelessly inadequate that the Coalition would have no choice but to fast-track their new experimental TR-9 suit line. Holt's voice dropped, hard and cold. You intentionally sabotaged a Class 9 training drill, Voss. You triggered a lethal environment to artificially inflate the perceived necessity of your own upcoming contract, fully expecting 51 cadets to die as tragic, unavoidable collateral damage on the way to securing your funding. Voss's face drained entirely of color, the bespoke polysilk suit suddenly looking far too tight around his collar. Beside him, Priya Sundaram rose immediately, packing her data slate into her briefcase with abrupt, frantic speed, instantly, visibly calculating the scale of the legal liability now bearing down on her, and moving to distance herself from her own client in real time. This is absurd, Voss stammered, raising both hands. These are fabricated allegations from a disgruntled officer and a primitive death worlder with an obvious grudge against corporate hardware. The code doesn't lie, Voss, Wren said coldly. And neither does the frostbite on my squad mate's hands. You tried to play God with the weather. You forgot that some of us were born inside the storms you're so terrified of. Admiral Sterling brought her gavel down with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted hall. Security, she barked. Take Mr. Voss into military custody, pending a full federal investigation into Solvanix's conduct. Suspend all pending contracts with their defense division, effective immediately. Two heavily armed coalition military police officers stepped out from the shadows along the back wall, firmly seizing Voss by both arms and dragging him, sputtering, out of the courtroom. The two corporate-affiliated directors on the panel looked as though they might genuinely be sick. Sterling turned her attention back to the podium, and the harshness that had defined her expression only minutes before had entirely vanished, replaced by something far closer to profound respect. "Cadet Callahan," she said, "you utilized unapproved survival tactics, destroyed military property, and technically violated no fewer than a dozen field regulations in the course of a single afternoon." Wren stood at attention, chin held high. "Yes, Admiral." "You also," Sterling continued, a faint smile finally breaking through her otherwise stoic demeanor, "saved the lives of 20 coalition cadets, exposed a massive, deliberate corporate conspiracy, and demonstrated exactly the kind of ingenuity, resilience, and unyielding grit that built this fleet in the first place." The Admiral rose from her seat and offered a crisp, perfectly executed salute across the hall. "All charges against you are dropped. This board formally commends you for exceptional valor under impossible conditions. You are a credit to this academy, Cadet Callahan, and you are a credit to Earth." The gallery erupted. 20 surviving members of Squad Alpha leapt to their feet, cheering and applauding so loudly the steel walls of Hall 7 visibly vibrated. Julian Ashford Vale, missing fingertips and all, cheered loudest of anyone, turning to Wren with a grin finally, completely free of his old colonial arrogance. Wren returned the Admiral's salute, a rare, genuine smile finally touching her lips. Later that evening, the Academy Mess Hall stood largely empty, save for Squad Alpha, who had commandeered a large circular table in the back corner. The atmosphere had transformed entirely in the space of 48 hours. There was no more invisible line dividing the wealthy colonial elites from the solitary Earthborn recruit. They were a bonded unit now, forged together in the Absolute Zero crucible of Permafrost 9. Julian slid a large, heavy cardboard box across the table toward Wren. "What's this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Colonel Holt pulled some strings with the quartermaster," Julian said, grinning. "Consider it an official apology from the Meridian Coalition for a serious lack of tactical supply chain management." Wren opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of packing foam, sat several sealed pouches of proper Blinny mix, a full crate of imported butter substitute, 2 jars of real fruit preserves, and a small brick of genuine dark chocolate for melting. Resting right on top, in an almost mocking bit of corporate irony, sat a sleek, heavy-duty ignition striker engraved with the now-suspended Solvanix logo, a final trophy stripped from their fallen enemy. Wren stared at the hall, her eyes going wide with something close to genuine, unguarded delight. It was, without exaggeration, the most beautiful thing she'd seen since leaving Earth. "Well," she breathed, picking up a pouch of Blinny mix like it was a sacred relic. She looked around the table at her squad, popping the striker's cap with a sharp, satisfying click, a small, bright flame catching the light across her face. "Who wants to learn how to make a proper Deathworld breakfast?" Julian leaned forward, holding out an empty mess tray like an offering plate. "Lead the way, Callahan. We follow you." The formal investigation into Solvanix Corporation's conduct opened officially within the week, and it did not stay contained to a single tribunal for long. What began as an inquiry into one sabotage training drill unraveled, over the following months, into something considerably larger and considerably uglier than anyone in that medical bay had initially imagined. Colonel Holt, promoted shortly afterward to a newly created oversight position within Fleet Command, specifically tasked with auditing defense contractor safety claims, led much of that early investigative work himself, driven by what he later admitted, in a private conversation with Wren, was a very personal fury at having nearly presided over the deaths of 51 cadets under his direct command because of a corporation's quarterly earnings report. Under his direction, fleet auditors began combing back through years of Solvanix's own internal documentation, cross-referencing training incidents, equipment failure reports, and contract negotiation timelines that, taken individually, had always seemed like ordinary, if occasionally unfortunate, coincidences. Taken together, they told a considerably darker story. The Permafrost 9 incident, it turned out, was not the first time Solvanix had quietly engineered a crisis to secure favorable contract terms. 2 years earlier, a supposedly random equipment malfunction aboard a training vessel called the Meridian's Reach had resulted in a near-catastrophic hull breach during a routine zero-gravity certification exercise. An incident that, at the time, had been quietly attributed to manufacturing defects in a rival contractor's sealant compound, conveniently clearing the way for Solvanix to win an emergency retrofit contract worth several hundred million credits. Auditors now suspected, based on newly recovered maintenance logs, that the defect had never existed at all, and that the sealant in question had, in fact, been sabotaged before installation by a Solvanix subcontractor working under a since-dissolved shell company. A separate incident, 4 years prior, involving a supposedly unpredictable equipment failure during a desert survival certification on the arid colony world of Cassandra, followed an almost identical pattern once investigators knew what to look for. A sudden, unexplained equipment failure, a conveniently timed contract vote, and a body count that, while lower than Permafrost 9's near miss, had nonetheless resulted in 3 cadet deaths quietly attributed, at the time, to extreme environmental variance beyond reasonable engineering tolerance. Wren was called to testify twice more over the following 6 months, first before a formal Senate subcommittee investigati, NG defense procurement fraud, and later, more informally, before a closed-door gathering of representatives from several rival contractors who, unsurprisingly, seemed eager to help build the strongest possible case against a competitor who had spent years quietly, ruthlessly undercutting them through exactly this kind of engineered catastrophe. She found the second kind of meeting considerably less comfortable than the first. "They don't actually care about the cadets," she told Julian afterward, the two of them sharing a quiet meal in the mess hall long after most of the rest of the academy had gone to sleep. "The Senate committee, sure, some of them genuinely do, but half these contractors just want Solvanix gone so they can bid on the contract themselves. I keep waiting for someone in one of these rooms to actually ask how Milo's doing, or whether Priya's hands ever fully recovered feeling. And instead, it's all margins and market share and who gets first refusal on the TR9 replacement bid." "Does that change what you're doing?" Julian asked. Wren considered the question for a long moment, turning her mess tray idly between her hands. "No," she finally said. "The facts are still the facts, whether the people listening to them care about the right reasons or not. I just wish it didn't feel quite so much like handing a loaded weapon to whoever happens to be standing closest when Solvanix finally goes down." The Senate subcommittee hearing, held some 3 months after the Permafrost 9 tribunal, took place in a chamber considerably grander and considerably colder, in its own way, than anything Wren had faced back at the academy. She sat alone at a small witness table, positioned before a horseshoe of elevated seats, occupied by 11 senators representing constituencies, scattered across a dozen different coalition worlds, most of whom, she suspected within the first 10 minutes, had never once in their lives spent a night anywhere colder than a poorly regulated office building. Cadet Callahan, began Senator Priyanka Oduya, the subcommittee's chair, a sharp-eyed woman from a temperate agricultural world who had, by reputation, built her entire career on defense procurement oversight. You've provided this committee with technical testimony regarding the sabotage code recovered from Cadet Ashford Vale's suit processor. I want to ask you something slightly outside that technical scope, if you'll permit me. In your professional opinion, was the Permafrost 9 incident an isolated failure of corporate ethics, or part of a broader pattern this committee should be concerned about? Wren considered the question carefully before answering, aware that whatever she said next would likely end up quoted, dissected, and repeated across a dozen coalition news networks by the following morning. Senator, I grew up somewhere that taught me to read weather patterns before I could read words on a page. A single bad storm is bad luck. 3 bad storms hitting the same region, on the same rough schedule every few years, right around the same time somebody happens to need a good excuse to raise prices on heating oil. That's not weather anymore. That's a pattern. I'd ask this committee to go looking for the pattern, not just the storm. A murmur moved through the gallery seats behind her, and Senator Oduya allowed herself the faintest, briefest smile. That's a very Earth way of putting it, Cadet. It's the only way I know how to put it, Senator. The hearing ran nearly 6 hours that day, and Wren found herself walking a careful, exhausting line throughout most of it. Precise and technical when the questions concerned the sabotage code itself. Deliberately plain and unadorned when the questions strayed, as they often did, into territory clearly designed to bait her into some quotable, emotional outburst that would play well on the evening broadcasts. She refused every time to give them one. Emotional outbursts, she'd learned early in her life, rarely fixed a broken water reclamation unit or a compromised heating grid. Facts, laid out plainly and repeated as many times as necessary, occasionally did. It was during a recess, standing in a marble-floored antechamber outside the hearing room, that she was approached by a tall, silver-haired man she didn't immediately recognize, wearing the modest, understated uniform of a coalition Senate liaison officer, rather than the expensive tailoring favored by most of the lobbyists circling the hearing that week. Cadet Callahan, Liaison Officer Amos Whitfield, representing the Office of Colonial Affairs. He extended a hand, which she shook briefly, still wary from 3 months of very carefully worded corporate courtesy that had nearly buried her under a false accusation. I wanted to thank you personally for something you likely don't realize you've already done. What's that? The Office of Colonial Affairs has spent 11 years trying, without much success, to get this. Senate to take Earth's colonial infrastructure funding seriously, Whitfield said. Every time we bring numbers to this committee, failure rates on water reclamation units, heating grid outages, preventable deaths during severe weather events, we get told the numbers are regrettable. But Earth's environment is simply understood to be harsh, and harsh environments produce harsh statistics, and there's only so much the coalition budget can reasonably do about geography. He paused, glancing back toward the closed hearing room doors. You just spent 6 hours demonstrating in front of 11 senators and every major news network in coalition space that a girl from one of Earth's poorest, most neglected regions possesses more practical survival engineering knowledge than a trillion-credit defense contractor's entire research division. That's a considerably harder thing for this committee to wave away as regrettable geography. Wren didn't have an immediate response to that. She thought instead of her grandmother's water reclamation unit, the one that had finally, stubbornly failed after 11 winters, the one whose repair had been the entire reason she'd signed her enlistment contract in the first place. "I didn't do any of this to fix funding formulas, Officer Whitfield." "No," Whitfield agreed. "Most people who end up fixing things never set out to do exactly that. Doesn't make the fixing any less real once it happens." He offered a small, tired smile. "For what it's worth, Cadet, there are a great many people back on Earth who are going to sleep a little easier tonight because of what you did out there in that snowdrift, whether or not any of them ever learn your name." The 3 cadet deaths on Cassandra, once formally reopened as part of the broader investigation, proved to be the single hardest thread Wren was asked to help pull. Unlike Permafrost 9, she had no personal connection to that earlier incident, no first-hand memory to draw from, only the cold, clinical satisfaction of recognizing, in a stack of 4-year-old maintenance logs handed to her by Colonel Holt's investigative team, the exact same fingerprint of deliberate sabotage she'd found buried in Julian's bricked suit processor. "It's the same pattern," she told the small gathering of fleet investigators crowded into a cramped conference room, 3 separate holographic displays glowing above the table, each one showing a different set of corrupted telemetry logs pulled from 3 different incidents spanning 4 years. "Look at the failure timing relative to the Senate contract calendar. Permafrost 9, 6 weeks before a trillion-credit environmental hardware vote. The Meridian's Reach hull breach, 4 weeks before an emergency retrofit contract renewal. Cassandra," she pulled up the 4th display, cross-referencing dates, 8 weeks before Solvanix's original desert survival hardware line was up for its 5-year recertification review. Every single time right before money was on the table, something conveniently, catastrophically broke. "That's a hell of a coincidence to build a conviction on," one of the investigators said, not unkindly, simply stating the obvious difficulty of the case ahead of them. "It's not a coincidence," Wren said. "It's a business model. They just built it quietly enough and spaced it out patiently enough that nobody ever put the whole picture side by side until now." The investigation into Cassandra eventually recovered enough corroborating evidence. Recovered communications between a Solvanix regional director and the same dissolved shell company implicated in the Meridian's Reach sabotage. Financial transfers timed suspiciously close to each incident. A whistleblower engineer who had quietly resigned from Solvanix 4 years earlier and had spent the years since working a considerably less glamorous job on a mid-tier agricultural colony, waiting. As she told investigators later, for someone to finally ask her the right questions, to formally reclassify all 3 Cassandra deaths as corporate manslaughter alongside the broader Solvanix indictment. Wren attended the formal notification of the Cassandra families personally, at Colonel Holt's quiet suggestion, though she was under no obligation to do so, and no one would have thought less of her for staying away. She stood near the back of a small gathering hall on a modest agricultural colony 3 jumps from the academy, watching 3 separate families receive, 4 years late, the truth about what had actually happened to their children during what they'd been told at the time was simply an unfortunate and unpredictable act of environmental variance. It was there that she met Corin Ash for the first time, a broad, weathered man who had spent 30 years working terraforming equipment on that same colony, whose daughter Talia had been one of the 3 cadets lost on Cassandra, and whose grief, even 4 years old, still sat visib, lie heavily across his shoulders the way a physical weight might. He found Ren near the exit afterward and simply gripped her hand for a long moment without speaking, an exchange she would carry with her in one form or another for the rest of her life. "You didn't know her," he finally said. "No reason you should have, but I wanted you to know somebody finally listened. 4 years and finally somebody listened." "I'm sorry it took this long," Ren said, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything else she'd said in the entire 14 months since Permafrost 9. "Don't be sorry," Corin said, releasing her hand. "Just don't let it happen a 4th time." She carried that conversation with her for a very long while afterward, longer, if she was honest with herself, than she carried most of the formal commendations that followed in the investigation's wake. The formal federal investigation concluded, some 14 months after the incident, with Solvanix Corporation's entire defense contracting division dissolved by Senate order, its remaining assets liquidated and redistributed across 3 smaller, more closely regulated contractors under a new oversight framework that Fleet Command, somewhat pointedly, named the Callahan Standard, a designation Wren herself found deeply endlessly embarrassing every time someone brought it up in her presence. Halbrook Voss was convicted on multiple counts of corporate manslaughter, fraud, and conspiracy, receiving a sentence that would keep him confined to a minimum security coalition penal colony for the better part of 2 decades. Priya Sundaram, in exchange for extensive cooperation with federal investigators and detailed testimony regarding the falsified telemetry logs, avoided prison entirely, but was permanently barred from practicing law anywhere within coalition territory. A professional death sentence that, according to later reporting, left her working as an unlicensed logistics consultant on a mid-tier trade station somewhere near the coalition's rim. A fate Wren found she couldn't quite bring herself to feel sorry about. The families of the 3 Cassandra cadets received, alongside the formal reclassification, both an apology from Fleet Command and a settlement from what remained of Solvanix's liquidated assets. Compensation that, as Corin Ash himself said plainly during a brief statement to coalition press outside the settlement hearing, could never properly balance against what had actually been taken from any of them. 4 years and 3 funerals too late for money to mean very much at all. Wren attended that press statement too, standing at the edge of the small crowd, watching Corin speak with the same plain, weathered steadiness she'd first encountered in that gathering hall weeks earlier. When the cameras finally moved on to chase some other fragment of the day's news cycle, he found her again near the edge of the crowd, and this time it was he who spoke first. "You testified about the pattern," he said. "The timing, contracts and disasters lining up like they did." "I did." Talia used to say something like that near the end before we lost contact with her unit, Corin said, his voice steady but not entirely even. "In her letters, she said the equipment out on Cassandra always seemed to act up right around review season like it knew. We thought she was just being dramatic. 20-year-olds far from home, they get dramatic about things." He shook his head slowly. "She wasn't being dramatic. She saw the same thing you saw. Nobody was in a position to listen to her the way they ended up listening to you." Wren didn't have a ready answer for that. Some things, she'd learned by then, didn't need one so much as they needed simply to be heard all the way through, without being rushed toward a tidy conclusion. She stood with Corin a while longer, saying very little, and found that the silence between them felt more honest than almost any of the formal testimony she'd given over the preceding 14 months. Julian Ashfordvale graduated 18 months after the incident, near the top of a class that had, in the wake of Permafrost 9, been quietly and permanently reshaped by the experience in ways that went far beyond any single cadet's individual transcript. He requested, and was granted, an assignment to fleet logistics oversight rather than the glamorous frontline command track his family's considerable influence could easily have secured for him instead. A decision that baffled his relatives back on Elysium Crest, and that he never fully explained to anyone outside his own small, tightly bonded circle of former Squad Alpha survivors. "Somebody's got to actually read the contracts before Fleet signs them," he told Wren, the two of them standing together on the Academy's observation deck the night before his transfer shipped out, watching the slow, distant wheel of stars beyond the reinforced viewport. "I spent my whole life a Sioux. Ming the engineering was always sound because the people who sold it to us wore nice suits and used the right words. I don't get to assume that anymore. None of us should." Milo Fenn, whose hands had shaken so badly during the initial drop that Wren had genuinely wondered whether he'd survive the pod ride down, went on to specialize in emergency field medicine, driven, by his own account, almost entirely by a stubborn determination to become the kind of steady presence in someone else's worst moment that Wren had been in his. He kept, for the remainder of his career, a small, carefully preserved fragment of scorched magnesium flare casing in his medical kit. Not for any practical purpose, he readily admitted, but as a reminder that the right knowledge, applied calmly at the right moment, mattered considerably more than the most expensive equipment money could buy. Priya Anand, whose scream over the failing comms had been among the first real signs that something had gone catastrophically wrong out in Sector 4, eventually transferred into environmental engineering, spending the following decade helping design and independently certify survival hardware for exactly the kind of coalition-wide oversight framework the Callahan Standard had established. Driven, she told a journalist covering the investigation's 5th anniversary, by a simple, unshakable resolve that she never again wanted to be the kind of engineer whose work could fail a squad of terrified cadets, simply because nobody outside a boardroom had bothered asking the right questions early enough. Colonel Holt remained with fleet oversight for the rest of his career, eventually rising to oversee the entire coalition-wide Defense Procurement Audit Division, a posting he privately described, in a memoir published some years after his retirement, as the only job I ever held that felt more like penance than promotion, and the only one I ever actually enjoyed. He and Wren stayed in loose but genuine contact for years afterward, exchanging the occasional message whenever some new procurement scandal broke across coalition news feeds, usually accompanied on Holt's end by some variation of the same dry observation. Another one, Callahan. Wonder if they packed the Blinny mix this time. Deshon Akri, the cadet who had first questioned Wren's unnatural comeback in the briefing room, and whose slurring, half-conscious voice had been among the ones Wren carried bodily out of the storm, transferred out of the frontline command track entirely within the year, enrolling instead in the Academy's small, chronically underfunded xenometeorology program. The study, as he explained it to anyone who asked, of how weather actually behaved on worlds nobody with real money had ever bothered building a proper forecasting network for. He spent the following years developing low-cost, ruggedized weather prediction hardware specifically intended for exactly the kind of neglected colonial regions Wren had grown up in, driven, he readily admitted, by the uncomfortable realization that he had nearly died inside a corporatron simulation, while an entire planet's worth of real people lived through storms just as dangerous every single season, with no simulation safety net, no rescue crawler, and no Ren Callahan digging them out of the snow when the forecast turned out to be wrong. His first fully deployed prediction network went online across three of Earth's most chronically underserved regions 6 years after Permafrost 9, Kalima included, a fact he made a point of mentioning to Ren personally, in a message that simply read, "Your grandmother's region has real forecasts now. Thought you'd want to know before anyone else told you." Pharaoh Denali, whose family's considerable shipbuilding fortune had done nothing at all to protect him from freezing to death against a rock face, while repeating 3 useless words into a dead channel, took considerably longer to find his footing afterward. He left the academy altogether within the year, a decision that scandalized his family and that he never publicly explained in any detail, though Ren, who exchanged the occasional letter with him over the following years, understood it well enough without needing it spelled out. Some kinds of fear, once fully experienced, simply couldn't be folded back up neatly enough to fit inside a dress uniform and a family legacy. He resurfaced eventually as a volunteer with a small, independent disaster relief organization operating out of the Coalition's Pura Rim colonies, doing the kind of unglamorous, physically exhausting work, digging, hauling, building, that had once been done for him by a stranger in a snowstorm, and that he now, by his own account, found considerably more meaning in than anything the family shipbuilding empire had ever offered him. "I used to think being useful meant commanding something big," he wrote to Ren, 4 years after Permafrost 9, from a relief camp on a flood. Ravaged agricultural world she'd never heard of before reading his letter. "Turns out it just means showing up and knowing what to do with your hands once you're there. You taught me that lying half-frozen against a rock, saying the same 3 words over and over because I didn't know any others. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for it. Consider this that." The story of Permafrost 9 did not stay confined to fleet tribunals and Senate subcommittees for very long. Within days of the initial hearing's public record being released, independent news networks across a dozen coalition worlds had picked up the footage of Ren's tribunal testimony, and within weeks, it had become something closer to a genuine cultural moment than either she or anyone at the Academy had ever anticipated. A grainy secondary recording of the moment she placed the scorched silicon chip onto the podium's data reader, captured by a gallery observer's personal device rather than the tribunal's own official system, circulated for months afterward across every major coalition network, accompanied by headlines ranging from the straightforwardly factual to the wildly, almost embarrassingly dramatic. Ren found the entire spectacle deeply uncomfortable. She turned down, over the following 2 years, no fewer than 40 separate requests for exclusive interviews, 3 offers to option her story for a dramatized entertainment feature, and 1 particularly bewildering proposal from a Meridian Prime confectionery company, hoping to license her name and likeness for a new line of Frontier Survivor breakfast pastries. An offer she declined so quickly, and with such visible offense that the junior fleet public affairs officer relaying it later admitted he'd never seen a decline delivered with quite that much personal conviction. "I didn't do any of it for attention," she told Colonel Holt, during one of their periodic check-ins roughly a year after the tribunal. "And I'm not about to start pretending I did just because some marketing department thinks my face would sell more crackers." "You could use the platform for something, Callahan," Holt pointed out, not for the first time. "People are listening to you right now in a way they weren't listening to the Office of Colonial Affairs for 11 years running. That's not nothing. I know, Ren admitted. I'm not saying I won't use it. I'm saying I'll use it on my own terms, not somebody else's marketing calendar. True to her word, she eventually accepted exactly one formal media engagement in the 2 years following the tribunal. A single, extended appearance before the coalition-wide Colonial Infrastructure Symposium. An unglamorous annual gathering of engineers, policy officials, and colonial administrators that attracted almost none of the flashy press coverage her tribunal testimony had generated. But that carried in the rooms that actually mattered for funding decisions. Considerably more institutional weight. She spent the better part of 2 hours walking a room full of budget officials through the precise, granular technical failures that had nearly killed 51 cadets, and through the far more mundane, far less dramatic infrastructure failures that killed considerably larger numbers of ordinary colonists on neglected worlds every single year, with none of the tribunal drama or press attention to ever hold anyone properly accountable for it. The symposium's funding recommendations that year included, for the first time in 11 years of the Office of Colonial Affairs pushing for it, a substantial multi-year infrastructure investment earmarked specifically for chronically underserved colonial regions, Earth's Kalima territory prominently included among them. Liaison Officer Whitfield, who attended the symposium specifically to hear Wren's testimony, later told her it was the fastest that particular funding line had ever moved through committee in the entire history of his office. You didn't even ask for it directly, he pointed out. You just told them what actually happens to underfunded equipment when the weather gets bad enough. Sometimes that's worth more than a direct ask. I've found that's usually true of most things worth asking for, Wren said. Ask directly and people get defensive. Show them the actual math and let them do the asking themselves. She spent the better part of the next decade traveling between coalition training facilities, personally certifying survival gear and environmental protocols on behalf of the very oversight framework that bore her own name, a role she approached with the same blunt, unglamorous practicality she'd once applied to digging a shelter out of a killing wind. She was not, by her own frequent insistence, any kind of hero. She had simply grown up somewhere that had taught her, early and thoroughly, exactly how thin the line really was between a survivable disaster and an unsurvivable one, and she had decided, somewhere in aftermath of that first long, cold night, that she was done letting people find that line out the hard way when a little honest preparation could move it somewhere safer instead. Her work took her over those years to environments considerably stranger and considerably more hostile than anything Permafrost 9's engineers had ever managed to simulate. She spent 11 weeks on the tidally locked colony world of Varanth Hollow, certifying survival protocols for a settlement clinging to the narrow, permanently twilight band between the planet's scorched sunward face and its frozen dark side, where a single miscalculated evacuation route could strand an entire outpost in temperatures that swung nearly 200 degrees within a few kilometers of travel. The Varanth Hollow assignment proved, in its own way, nearly as instructive as Permafrost 9 had been, though for entirely different reasons. The settlement's chief engineer, a weary, overworked woman named Consul Idra Marsh, met Wren on her first day with the particular wariness of someone who had spent years fighting a losing battle against underfunded infrastructure, and had learned, the hard way, not to trust anyone arriving with a fleet oversight designation and a clipboard. I've had inspectors before, Marsh told her flatly, on that first walk along the settlement's twilight perimeter. They come, they nod at the numbers we show them, they leave, and nothing changes except the paperwork gets a little thicker. I don't have the patience left for another one of those visits, Certifier Callahan. So if that's what this is, I'd appreciate you telling me now, so I can go back to the actual work instead of wasting a week entertaining you. It's not, Wren said. I've read the settlement's incident reports going back 6 years. I know your evacuation corridor on the eastern ridge has failed partial testing twice already, and I know your requisition requests for a redundant shelter cache have been denied 3 times by a budget committee that's never once set foot anywhere near this twilight line. I'm not here to nod at your numbers, Consul. I'm here to walk the corridor myself, find out exactly why it's failing, and put my own name on a report that this academy has learned, the expensive way not to quietly bury. Marsh studied her for a long moment, something in her tired, guarded expression shifting slightly. You're the Callahan, she finally said. The Permafrost 9-1. I try not to lead with that, Wren said, but yes. Then walk the corridor, Marsh said, something almost like hope creeping into her voice despite her obvious effort to keep it contained. I'll show you exactly where it fails, and you can tell me if I'm finally about to be believed. Wren spent the better part of her 11 weeks on Varanth Hollow doing precisely that, walking the failing evacuation corridor a dozen times under a dozen different simulated conditions, until she could document, with the same precise, granular certainty she'd once brought to a tribunal podium, exactly why the corridor's structural supports buckled under rapid thermal cycling, in a way the original contractor's design specifications had never accounted for. Her final report, submitted alongside a formal recommendation for the redundant shelter cache Marsh's settlement, had been requesting for 6 fruitless years, moved through the Coalition's revised procurement process with a speed that would have been unthinkable before the Callahan Standard existed, approved within a single budget cycle rather than the years of quiet institutional neglect that had preceded it. She spent a brutal, memorable season, after Varanth Hollow, on the storm-racked ocean world of Tessari Deep, where entire training classes learned to certify emergency flotation gear against wave patterns that made Permafrost 9's wind shear look, in her own private assessment, almost quaint by comparison. It was on Tessari Deep, 4 years after Permafrost 9, that she encountered the closest thing to a genuine second crisis in her certification career. A routine gear inspection that uncovered, buried in a supposedly independent contractor's flotation hardware, the same telltale fingerprint of deliberately falsified stress test data she'd first learned to recognize in Julian's bricked suit processor. The contractor in question, a smaller, considerably less powerful firm than Solvanix had ever been, folded almost immediately once confronted with Wren's findings, offering full cooperation with investigators in exchange for a reduced penalty, and the incident never escalated anywhere near the scale of the original tribunal. Feels almost anticlimactic, the junior investigator assigned to the case told her afterward, clearly having expected something closer to the dramatic courtroom reveal that had made Wren's name across Coalition news networks 4 years earlier. Good, Wren said. Anticlimactic means it got caught before anybody Ed instead of after. I'll take boring over dramatic every single time if boring means the paperwork happens early enough to matter. She returned to Earth exactly once during those 10 years, 5 years after Permafrost 9, on an extended leave granted, somewhat unusually, at Colonel Holt's own personal insistence, over Wren's initial and fairly stubborn objections that she had certification work scheduled and didn't particularly need a vacation. It's not a vacation, Callahan, Holt told her. in the same dry, unhurried tone he used for most of their exchanges by then. It's an inspection tour. The new colonial infrastructure investment is finally rolling out equipment to the Kalima region. Somebody with actual field credibility ought to go verify it's being installed correctly, rather than just trusting the contractor's paperwork the way everyone trusted Solvanix's paperwork right up until it nearly got 51 cadets killed. I can't think of anyone more qualified to make that trip than you, and I happen to know you haven't been home in 8 years. She couldn't, in the end, argue with either point. The Kalima region she returned to looked, in most visible ways, almost exactly as she remembered it. The same vast, silent stretch of white and gray extending toward a horizon that seemed to swallow the sky whole. The same settlements clustered tight and defensive against the wind. The same particular quality of cold that settled into a person's bones and stayed there for days after they'd come indoors. But scattered now among the familiar landscape were small, unfamiliar additions. A new relay tower on the ridge above her grandmother's settlement, carrying Deshon Akri's low-cost weather prediction network. A reinforced water reclamation unit, considerably sturdier than the one that had finally failed 8 years earlier, installed as part of the same infrastructure package her testimony had helped move through committee. A small, unassuming emergency shelter cache positioned at the settlement's edge, stocked, she noted with some private amusement, with a proper allotment of Blinny mix among its standard emergency rations. A detail she strongly suspected Colonel Holt had personally, quietly arranged as some kind of long-running joke between them. Her grandmother, older now, her hands more gnarled by cold and time than Wren remembered, met her at the settlement's edge without any particular ceremony, the way she'd always greeted Wren's returns from anywhere, near or far. "They finally fixed the water unit," her grandmother said by way of greeting, gesturing toward the new installation with visible, if understated, satisfaction. "Took them long enough. I hear that was you." "It was a lot of people," Wren said. "I just happened to be standing in the right room when the right question got asked." Her grandmother studied her for a long moment, the particular kind of assessing look she'd given Wren her entire life, the one that always seemed to see slightly further into a situation than Wren expected it to. "You always did that," she finally said. "Happened to be standing in the right room. Your grandfather was the same way. Never went looking for trouble, but trouble always seemed to know exactly where to find him, and he never once flinched from it when it did." She turned back toward the settlement, gesturing for Wren to follow. "Come inside. It's cold out here, and I imagine you've had quite enough of that particular conversation for one lifetime already." Wren stayed 11 days that visit, longer than she'd initially planned, walking the settlement's newly reinforced perimeter with a critical, professional eye by day, and sitting with her grandmother by the reclamation unit's steady, reliable hum in the evenings, listening to stories she'd heard 100 times before and finding, somewhat to her own surprise, that she still wanted to hear them 100 times more. On her last evening before shipping back out to resume her certification circuit, her grandmother handed her a small, carefully wrapped parcel, a fresh supply of proper Blinny mix, made from a recipe that had, by her grandmother's own insistence, never once been successfully replicated by any standard-issue military ration packet in the history of coalition food science. "For your kit," her grandmother said. "I hear you've been handing out the packet stuff to half-frozen cadets on strange worlds for years now. Figured it was time somebody sent you the real thing to work with instead." The 10-year anniversary of the Permafrost 9 incident arrived quietly, without any particular fanfare, on a date Wren herself had nearly let pass unnoticed amid a certification schedule that had taken her that month to a newly commissioned training facility on a volcanic world 3 sectors from the academy. It was Julian, by then a senior logistics officer with a reputation nearly as dry and exacting as Colonel Holt's own, who reached out first, with message so characteristically blunt that Wren laughed out loud reading it in her cramped field quarters. 10 years since you dug me out of a snowbank and called me an idiot for questioning your engineering choices. Holt's organizing something at the academy. Attendance is not, strictly speaking, mandatory, but I will be personally offended if you don't come. And I have spent a decade cultivating a reputation for being extremely difficult to personally offend, so consider the bar accordingly high. She told herself, boarding the transport, that it was mostly professional courtesy, a chance to review how the certification framework bearing her name had actually held up in practice over a full decade, rather than simply trusting the paperwork the way everyone had once trusted Solvanix's. That was, she privately admitted to herself somewhere over the long transit, only about half the real reason. The Academy's briefing room, when she finally stepped into it, looked almost exactly as she remembered. The same reinforced steel grating, the same rows of hard plastic seating, though considerably fewer of them now, arranged instead around a scattering of small tables for what had clearly been planned as something closer to an informal gathering than a formal ceremony. Colonel Holt, gray-haired now and walking with the faint, careful stiffness of a man well into his own retirement years, stood near the front of the room, and beside him, looking almost unbearably pleased with himself, was Julian, missing fingertips visible as he raised a mess hall mug in Wren's direction the moment she walked through the door. "Callahan," he called out, grinning, "you're late. Some things never change. Some flights don't reschedule themselves around your dramatic reunion timeline. Ashford Vale," Wren shot back, though she found herself smiling despite the long, exhausting transit behind her. They were not, in the end, a large gathering of the original 21 survivors of that snow shelter. Only 14 had been able to make the trip, scattered as they'd become across a decade of careers spanning half the Coalition's settled space. Milo Fenn arrived in a field medic's travel uniform, having flown in directly between emergency postings, his hands steadier now than they'd ever been that first frantic day in the drop pod. Priya Anand came with an entire portable display case of environmental hardware prototypes she was, by her own cheerful admission, entirely unable to stop herself from showing off to anyone who stood still long enough. Deshan Akri arrived last, having personally insisted on routing his transit through Kalima first to check on a relay tower installation, a detour that made him nearly 2 hours late, and that nobody in the room found even slightly surprising. Pharaoh Denali did not attend in person. His relief work had him stationed too far out along the Coalition's rim for the trip to be practical, but he sent a message that Colonel Holt read aloud to the assembled group, to a room gone notably quiet by its end. A brief, plainly worded account of the flood relief camp he was currently overseeing, closing with a line that made even Holt's usually steady voice catch slightly. "Tell Callahan I finally learned more than 3 words. Tell her I use them on somebody out here most days now." They spent the evening trading stories the way people who have survived something together always eventually do. Some of them exaggerated slightly with a decade's worth of retelling. Some of them still raw and careful even after 10 years. Most of them landing somewhere comfortably in between. Julian told, for what he cheerfully admitted was probably the 100th time, the story of Wren's tribunal testimony, playing up Voss's dramatic unraveling for maximum comic effect until even Wren, who remembered the actual tension of that day considerably more vividly than his retelling suggested, found herself laughing along with the rest of the room. Late in the evening, once most of the group had drifted into smaller side conversations, Colonel Holt found his way to Wren's table, lowering himself carefully into the seat across from her with the particular caution of a man whose joints had earned every bit of their current stiffness honestly. "The Callahan standard's holding up well," he said, without much preamble, the way he'd always preferred to open a conversation that actually mattered to him. "Full decade now. 14 major incidents caught during certification before they ever reached a live drop. 2 of them would likely have matched or exceeded Permafrost 9's casualty count if they'd gone uncaught." "That's the goal," Wren said. "Boring, caught early. Nobody ever has to sit through a tribunal like the one I sat through." "It is," Holt agreed. He was quiet for a moment, studying the small, half-finished mug of something warm in front of him. "You know, I spent most of my career believing the job was about being too GH enough to survive whatever the Coalition threw at a cadet. Took me a war criminal in a polysilk suit and a girl who complained about pancake mix in the middle of a near massacre to teach me the actual job was making sure toughness was never the only thing standing between a cadet and a body bag." He looked up at her, something unusually open in his weathered expression. "I don't say this often, Callahan, and I'd appreciate you not repeating it to Ashford Vale, who will absolutely never let me hear the end of it. But you didn't just save 20 cadets that day. You changed what this entire academy considers an acceptable risk to ask of the people who wear its uniform. That's a considerably bigger thing than most careers ever manage, and I don't think you've ever once let yourself sit with how big it actually is." Wren considered that for a long moment, turning her own mug slowly between her hands, watching the small gathering of old squad mates scattered across the room behind him. Julian gesturing animatedly through some story, Milo laughing at something Priya had said, Deshan already halfway through explaining some new detail of his relay network to anyone patient enough to listen. "Maybe not," she finally admitted. "I've mostly just tried to keep doing the next useful thing in front of me, never really stopped to measure it against anything bigger than that." "Maybe that's exactly why it worked," Holt said. "Most disasters happen because somebody was too busy measuring themselves against something bigger to notice the actual, small, useful thing sitting right in front of them." He raised his mug slightly, a small, tired, genuine toast. "To the next useful thing, then, Callahan, however small it happens to look at the time." Wren raised her own mug to meet his, and somewhere behind them, Julian's story reached whatever punchline he'd been building toward, and the whole small, scattered room of survivors broke into easy, unguarded laughter. The particular kind that only ever really belongs to people who once, a very long time ago and a very long way from anywhere warm, dug a hole together in the freezing dark and decided, against every reasonable expectation, that they were all going to see the next sunrise regardless of what it cost them to get there. "Eat," she'd tell them every time in every shelter on every world. "Morale matters. You can't properly survive a bad night if you're miserable about it the whole way through. My grandmother taught me that, and she was right about most things, so I'd start there if I were you." And somewhere out past the edge of 100 different storms, on 100 different worlds the rest of the galaxy still quietly classified as too hostile for comfortable living, a new generation of cadets learned, the way Wren Callahan had learned it decades before them, that the difference between dying afraid in the dark and surviving with a little dignity intact usually came down to exactly the same simple, stubborn thing it always had. Someone willing to dig the hole, strike the spark, and complain, loudly and sincerely, about the missing breakfast, right up until the storm finally broke.